"Stop making things up," Mrs. Patricia Collins said, her voice cutting clean through the classroom like a ruler against a desk. And then came the sound that made every head turn. The sharp, final rip of paper tearing straight down the middle. The drawing split in her hands, right through the chest of the figure in uniform, the penciled stars on the shoulder now broken into uneven halves. For a moment, nobody spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and cold, reflecting off the polished tile floor like nothing had happened at all. Jordan Carter didn't move. He stood beside his desk, fingers still curled around the edge of his notebook, eyes fixed on the pieces now hanging loosely between her hands. He blinked once, slow, as if trying to process not just the sound, but what it meant. Around him, chairs creaked softly as a few students shifted. Someone in the back let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but it died quickly when Mrs. Collins turned slightly, still holding the torn paper. "Your dad can't be a general," she continued, calmer now, like she was explaining something obvious. "We don't write fantasies in this classroom. We write facts." The word facts landed heavier than the tear. Jordan's gaze dropped for just a second, not in shame, but in something quieter, something harder to name. His desk was neat, too neat for a third grader. Pencil aligned with the edge, notebook squared perfectly, a small eraser worn down to the size of a thumbnail. Everything in order, everything controlled. Except this. Mrs. Collins walked the 2 steps to the trash can beside her desk and let the torn drawing fall. It didn't flutter. It dropped straight down, landing against the metal liner with a soft, hollow sound. Then she turned back to the board, picking up her marker as if the moment had already passed. "Open your books to page 42, she said, writing in clean, practiced strokes. "We're moving on." But Jordan didn't move. Not yet. His hands loosened from the desk slowly, one finger at a time, like he was releasing something fragile. Then he stepped forward. One step, then another. The room felt different now, thicker, quieter, like everyone was holding something in. He reached the trash can and paused, just for a breath. His reflection stared back at him in the dull metal surface, distorted by the curve. For a second, it looked like 2 versions of him standing there. Then he reached in. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate either. His fingers found the first piece of paper, then the second, lifting them carefully, as if they might fall apart again. He smoothed one half against his palm, the crease running jagged through the drawing where the uniform had been. The stars he had shaded in so carefully were now cut uneven, one side slightly darker than the other. He pressed the edges together, trying to line them up. It wasn't perfect. It couldn't be. But he kept trying anyway. Behind him, the sound of pages turning filled the room, uneven and scattered. A pencil rolled off someone's desk and hit the floor with a soft tap. Mrs. Collins kept writing, her back to him, her voice steady as she explained the assignment. Like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't been standing right there. Jordan didn't say a word. He carried the torn drawing back to his desk and laid it flat, pressing it down gently with both hands. His fingertips lingered along the tear, tracing it once, slow. Then he reached into his pocket. The photo inside was folded small, edges worn soft from being opened too many times. He hesitated for just a second before pulling it out. He didn't unfold it all the way, just enough to see the corner, the dark uniform, the line of metals catching light, the edge of a sleeve he knew by heart. He closed it again quickly and slipped it back into his pocket. His shoulders rose and fell once, a quiet breath in, then out. Around him, the lesson went on. Numbers on the board, voices low, chairs shifting. Normal. But something had shifted anyway. Something no one had said out loud. Outside the classroom, down the long hallway lined with lockers and faded posters, a distant sound echoed, faint at first, almost easy to miss. A car door closing. Then another. He didn't look up. Not yet. But his hands stilled on the paper, fingers pressing the 2 F's together just a little tighter, as if he already knew something the rest of. The room didn't. The faint echo from the hallway grew clearer, not loud enough to interrupt the lesson, but sharp enough to cut through Jordan's focus like a distant signal he could not ignore. Mrs. Collins continued writing across the board, the markers squeaking in steady strokes, each word precise, controlled, unshaken. Page 42. She repeated without turning around, as if repetition alone could anchor the room back into order. A few students flipped their pages again, slower this time, glancing up between movements. Something in the air had shifted, even if no one wanted to say it. Jordan kept his hands on the torn drawing, pressing the edges together as if pressure alone could restore what had been taken apart. His thumbs moved carefully along the seam, smoothing it down, memorizing the break. He did not rush. He did not look at anyone. He just breathed, steady and quiet, like he was holding something in place inside himself. The hum of the lights seemed louder now, filling the silence between each word Mrs. Collins spoke. Then came another sound, closer this time. The unmistakable rhythm of footsteps in the hallway. Not rushed, not scattered like students between classes, but measured, deliberate. Each step landing with a soft, solid weight against the floor. A few heads turned toward the door without meaning to. The handle did not move. Not yet. Mrs. Collins paused for the briefest second, her marker hovering midair before continuing again, just slightly faster than before. You will complete questions 1 through 10, she said, her voice still firm, but thinner now, stretched just enough to reveal something underneath. Jordan finally lifted his eyes, not to the teacher, not to the class, but toward the door. His expression did not change. It never really had. But there was something different in the way he held himself now. Something steadier, like the quiet inside him had settled into certainty. In his pocket, the folded photo pressed against his side. A small, constant reminder that truth did not need to be loud to exist. The footsteps stopped just outside the classroom. Silence followed. Not the ordinary kind that drifted between moments, but the kind that held everything still, waiting. Even the air felt heavier, like it was listening. One student near the window shifted in their seat, the legs of the chair scraping lightly against the floor. Another leaned forward just enough to see the hallway through the narrow glass panel beside the door, then quickly sat back, eyes wide but saying nothing. Mrs. Collins set the marker down with a soft click against the tray and turned halfway toward the class, as if about to speak again, but the words did not come immediately. Her posture remained straight, practiced, but her eyes flicked once toward the door before returning to the room. Jordan's fingers eased off the paper. The two have stayed together on his desk, imperfect but aligned. He did not try to fix it anymore. He just let it be. The handle shifted slightly. Not fully, just enough to catch the light. A quiet metallic sound followed, small but unmistakable. Jordan did not look away. His shoulders remained still, his breathing even, his gaze calm. Whatever was about to happen, he was not afraid of it. He had never been trying to prove anything, only to tell the truth. And now, just beyond the door, something was about to answer for it. The handle turned. Not fast, not slow, just enough to break the stillness that had settled over the room like a held breath. The door opened a few inches, then wider, and light from the hallway stretched across the floor in a long, pale strip that reached almost to Jordan's desk. No one spoke. Not even the hum of the lights felt the same anymore. Mrs. Collins straightened instinctively, her shoulders lifting a fraction as she faced the door fully now, the practiced authority in her posture still there, but thinner, like something underneath had begun to shift. A man stepped into the doorway, not in a rush, not with noise, but with a quiet presence that seemed to change the space the moment he crossed into it. His uniform was pressed sharp, the lines clean, the details precise down to the smallest seam. The insignia on his shoulders caught the light, not bright, but steady. 4 stars. Not loud, not announced, just there. A second figure remained just behind him in the hallway, out of focus, but still enough to suggest this was not ordinary. A few students leaned forward in their seats, eyes widening without meaning to. One girl near the front stopped mid-sentence, her pencil hovering above the page as if time itself had paused. Mrs. Collins opened her mouth, then closed it again, her expression tightening just slightly before she found her voice. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone controlled, though the edges were no longer as sharp. The man did not answer immediately. His eyes moved across the room once, slow and deliberate, taking in the desks, the board, the students, until they settled on one place. Jordan. It was not a long look, just enough. But something in that moment shifted again, deeper this time. Jordan did not stand. He did not wave. He simply met the gaze, calm, steady, like he had been waiting without needing to. The man stepped further into the room, the soft sound of his shoes against the tile echoing more than it should have. not because it was loud, but because everything else had gone completely silent. Mrs. Collins took a small step to the side, almost without realizing it, creating space that had not been there a moment ago. "This is a classroom," she said, more carefully now. "We are in the middle of a lesson." The man nodded once, acknowledging her words without challenge. His voice, when it came, was low, measured, and unmistakably calm. "I will not take long." It was not a request. It was not an interruption. It was simply a statement that settled into the room with weight. A few students exchanged glances, unsure whether to look at the teacher or the man, caught between two forms of authority that no longer felt equal. Jordan's hand rested lightly on the torn drawing in front of him. He did not try to hide it. He did not move it away. He just let it sit there, the seam visible, the break undeniable. The man's eyes dropped briefly to the paper, then lifted again, something unreadable passing across his face. Not anger, not surprise, but recognition. Mrs. Collins followed his gaze for the first time. Her eyes landed on the drawing, then on the tear, then on Jordan. The silence deepened. For the first time since the moment began, she did not have words ready. The room held that pause, stretched thin between what had been said and what had not. And in that space, something unspoken began to rise, quiet but impossible to ignore. Mrs. Collins' gaze stayed on the torn drawing longer than it should have, her eyes tracing the uneven line where the paper had split, as if the tear itself was now louder than anything she had said moments ago. The man took another step forward, not toward her, but toward the center of the room, his presence steady, unhurried, filling the silence without raising his voice. The faint scent of cold air followed him in from the hallway, mixing with the chalk dust and the sterile smell of the classroom. Jordan remained seated, his back straight, his hands resting lightly on the desk, no longer pressing the paper together, just holding his place. The man stopped beside the first row of desks, close enough now that the details of his uniform became undeniable, the stitching, the alignment, the quiet authority carried in every inch of it. A boy near the aisle shifted in his seat, eyes fixed on the stars at the man's shoulders, as if counting them, as if trying to understand what they meant. Mrs. Collins cleared her throat softly, the sound small compared to the weight in the room. "Sir," she said, her voice carefully measured, "if this is about administration, I can step outside." The man shook his head once, not dismissive, just certain. "No need," he replied, his tone even, controlled, the kind that did not need volume to be heard. His eyes moved again, back to Jordan, then to the drawing, then briefly to Mrs. Collins. "I was told there was a concern," he added. The word concern lingered, simple but heavy, carrying more than it seemed to say. A few students exchanged quick glances, their curiosity now sharper, more focused, as if the pieces were beginning to form something they could almost see. Mrs. Collins' posture shifted again, subtle but real, her shoulders drawing in just slightly, her certainty no longer as solid as it had been. "There is no concern," she said, a fraction too quickly. "Just a misunderstanding." The man nodded. Once more, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. His attention returned to the desk in front of Jordan. For a moment, he did not speak. He simply looked. The torn paper, the careful alignment, the quiet hands that had not tried to hide it. Then, without asking, he reached down, not to take it away, but to lift one corner gently, enough to see the full image that had been broken. The drawing showed a figure standing tall, uniform precise, shoulders squared, stars marked carefully in pencil, each one shaded with deliberate effort. It was not perfect. It was not professional, but it was intentional. Every line placed with meaning. The man's fingers paused at the edge, then released the paper, letting it fall back into place exactly where it had been. His jaw tightened just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of something deeper. Mrs. Collins followed the motion, her eyes widening just enough to reveal that she now saw what she had dismissed before. The room held its breath again. The man straightened, his full height now clear, his presence undeniable. He turned his head toward Mrs. Collins, meeting her gaze directly for the first time. There was no accusation in his eyes, no raised voice, just a quiet, unwavering clarity. Then he spoke, his voice calm, steady, and precise. "I believe this belongs to your student," he said, nodding slightly toward the desk. The words were simple, but they shifted the weight of the room completely. Mrs. Collins opened her mouth, then paused. The response caught somewhere between what she had believed and what was now standing in front of her. And in that pause, every student in the room understood something had changed, even if no one had said it out loud yet. Mrs. Collins' fingers tightened slightly around the marker still resting in her hand, though she no longer wrote anything on the board. The words she had been so certain about moments ago now felt distant, like something said in a different room by a different person. She looked at the man, then at the drawing again, then back at Jordan, as if trying to realign everything she thought she understood with what was now plainly in front of her. I did not realize, she began, her voice softer, less certain, the edges no longer sharp. But the sentence did not finish. It hung there, incomplete, unable to bridge the gap between assumption and reality. The man did not interrupt her. He did not correct her either. He simply stood, composed, his hands at his sides, his posture unchanged, as if he had long learned that truth did not require urgency to be known. The silence stretched again, but it was different now. Not tense, not heavy, just clear. A kind of clarity that made everything else feel smaller. Jordan lowered his eyes briefly to the drawing, then back up again. His expression remained calm, but there was something new in it now. Not pride, not relief, just a quiet steadiness, like something inside him had settled into place. Mrs. Collins took a small step closer to the desk, almost unconsciously, her attention drawn fully to the torn paper. "You said your father," she started, then stopped, the rest of the sentence dissolving before it could form. The man turned his head slightly toward Jordan, his gaze softening in a way that was almost imperceptible, but real. "You did not say anything wrong," he said, his voice still calm, but now carrying something warmer beneath it. The words were not loud, but they reached every corner of the room. A student near the back slowly lowered their pencil, eyes fixed on the scene unfolding, as if afraid to miss a single moment. Jordan's shoulders eased just a fraction, the smallest release, but enough to show he had heard it. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply nodded once, subtle and quiet. Mrs. Collins' gaze shifted between them, the connection now undeniable, the truth no longer something she could question or dismiss. The authority she had carried so easily before now felt different in her own hands, less certain, more fragile. She looked down at the drawing again, really looked this time, at the careful lines, the effort in each detail, the intention she had overlooked. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she reached out and touched the edge of the paper, her fingers brushing the seam where it had been torn. She did not try to fix it. She did not pull it apart either. She just rested her hand there for a moment, as if acknowledging what had been done. The man watched quietly, saying nothing, allowing the moment to settle without forcing it forward. Then, after a brief pause, he stepped closer to the desk, standing beside Jordan now, not in front of him, not above him, but beside him. The shift was subtle, but everyone in the room felt it. "I am here for my son," he said finally, his voice steady, grounded, the words simple but carrying the full weight of everything that had just unfolded. The sentence landed differently than anything before it, not as a correction, not as a defense, but as a truth that needed no explanation. Mrs. Collins inhaled slowly, her posture adjusting once more, this time not to assert control, but to understand it. Around them, the classroom remained completely still, every student watching, listening, learning something that was not written on the board. And in that quiet, unmistakable moment, the story that had been questioned just minutes ago stood fully revealed, not through argument, not through volume, but through presence alone. The words settled into the room slowly, not with force, but with weight that no one could ignore. "I am here for my son." They did not echo, yet they seemed to reach every corner of the classroom, filling the space where doubt had lived just moments before. Mrs. Collins stood still, her hand withdrawing from the edge of the paper, as if the contact itself had revealed more than she expected. Her eyes moved from the man to Jordan again, searching now, not judging, not correcting, but trying to understand what she had failed to see. The board behind her still held the assignment, clean and structured, but no one was looking at it anymore. The lesson had shifted, and everyone knew it. Jordan remained seated, but something about him had changed. Not outwardly, not in a way that could be easily described. His posture was the same, his hands still resting near the torn drawing, but the quiet around him felt different, fuller, grounded. He glanced down once more at the paper, then gently adjusted one edge so the line matched as closely as it could. He did not try to erase the tear. He simply accepted it, the way it was. The man beside him noticed the movement, his gaze following the careful gesture. For a brief moment, his expression softened again, something almost like pride passing through before returning to stillness. He lowered himself slightly, not kneeling, not making a scene, just enough to be closer to Jordan's level. "You kept it," he said quietly. His voice meant only for the boy, but the silence of the room carried it further. Jordan nodded once, small but certain. "Yes, sir." The formality in his tone was natural, not forced, something learned, something respected. A student near the window shifted again, their eyes moving between them, absorbing the exchange like it mattered more than anything else that day. Mrs. Collins exhaled slowly, the sound almost inaudible, but it marked a change. She stepped closer to the desk, no longer standing at the front as the center of authority, but moving into the space where the moment had unfolded. "Jordan," she said, his name softer now, careful, as if she was testing how to say it correctly. He looked up at her, not hesitant, not defensive, just present. She paused, searching for the right words, but they did not come easily. For someone who had spoken with certainty before, this silence was unfamiliar. "I should not have," she began, then stopped, the sentence breaking before it could fully form. The admission was there, incomplete but clear. The man did not look at her. He did not need to. His attention remained with Jordan, steady, protective in a way that did not require explanation. "You told the truth," he said again, this time a little firmer, not louder, just more certain, as if reinforcing something that had already been proven. Jordan's fingers rested lightly on the drawing, his thumb tracing the edge of one star that had been split. He did not speak, but his breathing steadied, the small rise and fall of his shoulders the only sign of the shift happening inside him. Around them, the classroom remained silent, every student still watching, still listening, learning something that could not be written down or graded. Mrs. Collins lowered her gaze to the paper one last time, then back to Jordan, and in that look was something new, something she had not shown before. Not authority, not correction, something closer to respect, though she had not yet found the words to say it. The man straightened slowly, his full presence returning, calm and grounded. He did not rush the moment forward. He allowed it to settle, to be understood without pressure. And in that quiet space, where nothing more needed to be proven, the truth stood on its own, steady and undeniable, changing the room without a single raised voice. The room did not return to normal. Not right away. The air still carried something unspoken, something that had shifted too deeply to simply fade. Mrs. Collins moved slowly back toward the front of the room, but her steps were different now, less certain, less automatic. The marker was still in her hand, but she did not raise it to the board. She just held it there, as if unsure what could possibly matter after what had just happened. A student in the second row looked down at their open book, then back up again, the words on the page no longer holding any meaning. Jordan remained where he was, his attention still on the drawing, but his posture had changed in a way that was subtle yet undeniable. He was no longer trying to fix it. He had stopped pressing the edges together. The tear was still there, visible, imperfect, but it no longer felt like something that needed to be hidden. It was simply part of the paper now, like a mark that told its own story. The man beside him glanced toward the rest of the class, his eyes moving across the room with quiet awareness. He did not speak to them directly, but his presence alone seemed to steady something, like a line had been drawn without words. A boy near the back shifted in his seat and straightened his posture without realizing it, as if responding to something he could not fully explain. Mrs. Collins finally set the marker down on the tray, the small click sounding louder than expected in the silence. She turned to face the class, but her usual composure was gone. Not completely, but enough that it could be seen. "Class," she said, her voice softer now, searching for its place. Again, no one answered. No one needed to. They were already watching, already listening in a way they had not been before. She paused, then looked at Jordan again, this time without distance, without the barrier she had held earlier. "We are going to take a moment," she added, the words careful, deliberate. It was not an instruction. It was an acknowledgement. The man nodded slightly, almost imperceptible, as if agreeing to the space she was creating, but not claiming it. He turned back to Jordan and rested his hand lightly on the edge of the desk, not touching the drawing, not interrupting, just being there. "You did well," he said quietly, his voice steady, meant for the boy but carried by the silence to everyone else. Jordan looked up at him, meeting his eyes fully now. There was no hesitation in his gaze, no need to prove anything. Just recognition. "I just told the truth," he replied, his voice calm, simple, as if the explanation required nothing more. The man gave a small nod, the kind that carried understanding without needing to expand on it. Across the room, a girl who had laughed earlier lowered her eyes, her fingers tightening around her pencil, as if she was holding on to something she wished she had not done. Another student leaned back slowly, their expression thoughtful, the moment settling into them in a way that would not be easily forgotten. Mrs. Collins watched all of it, the quiet shifts, the unspoken realizations moving through her classroom like a current she could not control. For the first time, she did not try to lead it. She let it happen. The lesson had already changed. The man straightened again, his presence returning to its full height, composed and steady. He glanced once more at the drawing, then at Jordan, and something in his expression lingered there for a second longer than before, something personal, something grounded. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The truth had already been spoken, already seen. And in that quiet classroom, where no one had raised their voice, something far more lasting had taken its place. The silence did not break, but it changed shape, softer now, less tense, as if the room had exhaled. Without anyone noticing, outside the window, sunlight shifted slightly across the floor, the pale line moving inch by inch toward the legs of Jordan's desk, catching on the edge of his shoe. No one reached for their books. No one asked what came next. They were still inside the moment, and somehow, no one wanted to leave it too quickly. Mrs. Collins rested both hands lightly on the front of her desk, her fingers spread flat against the surface as if grounding herself in something steady. Her eyes moved across the classroom, slower than before, taking in each student not as a group to manage, but as individuals watching her, waiting without saying it. When her gaze returned to Jordan, it stayed there, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet reflection that had not been there before. "Jordan," she said again, his name more certain this time, but still gentle, careful. He looked up at her, meeting her eyes without hesitation. There was no fear in his expression, no guardedness, just openness, like he had nothing left to defend. She paused, then nodded once, almost to herself, as if confirming something she had only just understood. "Thank you," she said, the words simple, but heavier than anything she had said earlier. A few students shifted in their seats, the acknowledgement settling over them like something they did not expect to hear. The man beside Jordan did not react outwardly, but his gaze softened just slightly, recognizing the shift for what it was. Not an apology spoken fully, but the beginning of one. Jordan gave a small nod in return, not making a moment of it, not holding on to it, just accepting it the way he had accepted everything else, quietly. His hand moved once more over the drawing, smoothing the surface gently, not to fix it, but to keep it steady. The tear remained, but it no longer felt like damage. It felt like something witnessed. Across the room, a student raised their hand halfway, then lowered it again, unsure if questions still belonged here. The usual rhythm of the classroom had not returned, and no one seemed eager to force it back. Mrs. Collins straightened slightly, her posture adjusting, not to reclaim authority, but to carry it differently. "We are going to continue," she said, but her voice held a new tone now, one that did not push, did not demand, but invited. "Take your time." It was a small change, but it landed differently. The students reached for their books more slowly this time, the pages turning with less noise, less urgency. Learning had shifted from something assigned to something felt. The man stepped back just a half step, giving Jordan space again, but remaining close enough to be present. His eyes moved once more across the room, then back to his son. "I will be right outside," he said quietly, his voice steady, reassuring without drawing attention. Jordan nodded again, calm, certain, as if he had expected nothing more and nothing less. The man turned toward the door, his movement measured, composed, leaving the same quiet impression as when he entered. As he reached the doorway, he paused briefly, not turning back fully, but enough to glance once more at the classroom behind him. Not to check, not to correct, just to see. Then he stepped into the hallway, and the door remained open just slightly, letting the light continue to fall across the floor. Inside the room, the shift remained. The lesson moved forward, but not the way it had before. And at his desk, Jordan sat with the torn drawing in front of him, no longer trying to prove anything, no longer needing to. He simply stayed present, steady, like the truth had always been. The classroom did not snap back into its old rhythm. It eased into something slower, something more aware, like every movement now carried a little more weight than before. Pages turned, but softer. Pencils moved, but with pauses in between, as if each student was still thinking about what they had just seen, still holding on to it without knowing how to let it go. Mrs. Collins walked back to the board, but she did not pick up the marker right away. She stood there for a moment, looking at the lesson she had written earlier, the neat lines, the structured instructions, and something about it felt incomplete now. Not wrong, just smaller. She reached for the marker eventually, but instead of continuing where she left off, she erased a portion of the board slowly, the faint sound of the eraser brushing against the surface filling the room in a quiet, steady rhythm. No one spoke. Jordan glanced up briefly, watching the motion, then returned his attention to the paper in front of him. His fingers rested lightly on the edges, no longer pressing, no longer fixing, just holding it in place. The seam was still visible, but it no longer drew his focus the way it had before. He picked up his pencil and, after a short pause, began to trace along one of the lines in the drawing, reinforcing it carefully, not to hide the tear, but to continue the image beyond it. A student beside him leaned slightly closer, not enough to be obvious, but enough to see what he was doing. Their eyes followed the movement of his pencil, the steady hand, the quiet intention, and something in their expression softened. Across the room, the girl who had laughed earlier shifted again, her posture more closed now, her gaze lowered toward her own desk. She picked up her pencil, but instead of writing immediately, she hesitated, then slowly erased a small mark on her page, as if correcting something that had nothing to do with the assignment. Mrs. Collins turned back to the class, the board behind her partially cleared, her hands resting lightly at her sides. "You may continue," she said, her voice calm, but different now, less directive, more present. It was not just an instruction anymore. It was permission. The students resumed their work, but the room did not lose what had happened. It stayed there, woven into the quiet, into the way they sat, the way they listened, the way they thought. Jordan continued drawing, his pencil moving with steady purpose, adding small details where the tear had interrupted the image, connecting what had been separated without trying to erase the break itself. The door remained slightly open, the line of light still stretching across the floor, a reminder that something beyond the classroom had entered and left, but not without leaving something behind. A faint movement in the hallway passed by the opening, just a shadow crossing the light, then gone. Jordan noticed it, just for a second, then returned to his work. He did not need to look again. He already knew. Mrs. Collins watched him for a moment longer than she intended, her eyes following the careful motion of his pencil, the quiet focus, the absence of any need to prove himself. She inhaled slowly, then turned her attention back to the rest of the class, but her awareness lingered, like a lesson she was still learning herself. The classroom continued, but it was no longer the same place it had been at the start of the day. Something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would stay, in the way they spoke, in the way they listened, in the way they saw each other. And at his desk, Jordan kept drawing, steady and calm, not fixing the past, not erasing what had happened, but continuing forward, line by line, exactly where the truth had always been. The steady rhythm of pencils on paper continued, soft and uneven, like the room was learning how to move again without breaking the quiet that had settled in. The sunlight had shifted further now, stretching across the floor and touching the leg of Jordan's desk, catching the edge of the torn drawing just enough to highlight the seam that still ran through it. He did not look at the tear anymore. His focus had moved beyond it, his pencil adding detail to the uniform, deepening the lines, refining the shape, as if the image itself mattered more than what had interrupted it. Across the room, Mrs. Collins stood near the board again, but she had not written anything new. Her eyes moved from student to student, slower than before, noticing things she might have overlooked earlier, the way one student leaned in to help another, the way someone paused before speaking, choosing their words more carefully. When her gaze returned to Jordan, she did not look away immediately this time. She watched him finish a small line near the shoulder of the figure, the place where the stars had been split. He did not erase the break. He simply drew around it, incorporating it into the image in a way that made it feel intentional, as if it had always been there. Something in that small decision stayed with her. The door at the side of the room shifted slightly as someone passed in the hallway, the movement subtle but enough to remind everyone that the world outside had not stopped, even if this room had paused. A faint voice echoed in the distance, then faded. Jordan set his pencil down for a moment and looked at the drawing as a whole, taking it in, not with judgment, but with quiet acknowledgement. It was not perfect, but it was real. He rested his hand beside it, not covering it, not hiding it, just letting it be seen. A student across from him leaned forward just slightly, eyes tracing the lines of the drawing, the detail in the uniform, the careful shading of the stars. "That looks," the student began softly, then stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. Jordan glanced up, meeting their eyes briefly, then back to the paper. "It is him," he said simply. There was no need to explain further. The student nodded once, slowly, as if understanding more than the words themselves. Mrs. Collins heard the exchange, her attention shifting toward them, her expression thoughtful, reflective. She took a step closer, not to interrupt, but to observe, to see what had been in front of her all along. "You remember all of that detail?" she asked quietly, her tone no longer questioning, but curious. Jordan nodded again. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was calm, steady, the same as before, but now it carried a quiet confidence that did not need to prove itself. She looked at the drawing again, really seeing it this time, the effort, the care, the truth embedded in each line. "That takes focus," she said, almost to herself. It was not praise in the usual sense. It was recognition. Around them, the class continued, but the attention had shifted, the students now aware of something deeper than the assignment on the board. The lesson was no longer just about pages and answers. It was about seeing, about listening, about understanding what had been missed. Jordan picked up his pencil again and added one final line, connecting the edge of the tear to the rest of the drawing in a way that felt complete, not fixed, but whole. He paused, then set the pencil down gently. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer heavy. It was steady, and in that steady space, something had been corrected, not with words, not with force, but with truth that had finally been seen for what it was. The room continued in that quiet rhythm, but something inside it had shifted permanently, like a line had been redrawn, and everyone could feel it even if they could not name it. Mrs. Collins remained near the front, her hands no longer gripping the marker, her posture no longer rigid with control, but steady in a different way, more aware, more deliberate. She looked toward Jordan again, not as a problem to correct, not as a student to manage, but as someone she had misunderstood. The weight of that realization did not show loudly on her face, but it was there in the way she paused before speaking, in the way her voice carried less certainty and more intention. "Jordan," she said once more, stepping slightly closer to his desk, not towering over him, not creating distance, but closing it. He looked up at her, calm as always, his expression unchanged, but his presence grounded in something that no longer needed validation. She hesitated for a moment, the silence stretching just enough to make the next words matter. "Would you be willing to tell the class about your drawing?" she asked, her tone careful, respectful, leaving space for him to choose. A few students shifted in their seats, their attention turning fully toward him, not out of curiosity alone, but something closer to respect, something they had not shown before. Jordan glanced down at the paper, his fingers resting lightly along the edge where the tears still showed. He did not rush his answer. He did not look around the room to measure reactions. He simply thought for a moment, then nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was quiet, but steady, carrying easily in the silence. He lifted the drawing slightly, holding it just above the desk, not high, not for display, just enough so it could be seen. "My dad wears this every day," he said, his words simple, direct, without embellishment. "He told me the stars mean responsibility." The room stayed still, every student listening, not interrupting, not whispering, just taking in the words as they were. Jordan continued, his voice even, not emotional, but honest. "He says people look at the uniform and think it is about power, but it is about taking care of others." A student near the front leaned forward slightly, their eyes fixed on the drawing, on the stars that had been split and redrawn. Mrs. Collins listened closely, her expression softening with each word, the meaning settling into her in a way that went beyond the surface. Jordan lowered the drawing slightly, his gaze steady. "I drew him like this because that is how I see him," he added. No explanation beyond that. No need to defend it. The truth stood on its own. A quiet breath moved through the room, almost like a shared realization passing from one student to another. Mrs. Collins nodded slowly, her eyes remaining on him, the understanding now clear. "Thank you," she said again. But this time the words carried more weight, more sincerity, more recognition of what had been given. Jordan placed the drawing back on his desk carefully, smoothing it once more, not to fix it, but to keep it steady. The tear remained visible, but it no longer defined the image. Around him, the class did not return to chatter or distraction. They remained present, aware, as if something important had just been said without needing to be repeated. And in that quiet space, where no one rushed to move on, the lesson continued, not written on the board, but understood in a way that would last far beyond the classroom. The classroom remained still long after Jordan lowered his drawing, as if no one wanted to be the first to break what had just settled between them. The quiet was no longer uncertain. It was full, steady, carrying meaning in a way that words could not replace. Mrs. Collins stood just a few feet away, her gaze resting on the paper for a moment before lifting again to meet Jordan's eyes. This time, there was no hesitation, no searching for authority, no attempt to correct or guide. There was only acknowledgement. She took a slow breath, her shoulders easing in a way that had not happened all morning. "What you said," she began, her voice softer than ever before, but clear, "that is something not everyone understands." The words were not directed only at him. They reached the entire room, settling over each student like something to hold on to. A boy near the window leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful, his earlier curiosity now replaced with something deeper, something quieter. The girl who had laughed earlier kept her eyes on her desk, but her posture had changed, her shoulders drawn inward, her pencil resting untouched in her hand. Mrs. Collins shifted her weight slightly, then did something no one expected. She stepped closer to Jordan's desk again, but this time she lowered herself just enough so that she was no longer standing above him. The movement was small, but it changed everything. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice steady, not rushed, not forced, but intentional. The words hung in the air, simple and direct, without excuse, without explanation. A few students exchanged quick glances, surprised not by the admission itself, but by how openly it was given. Jordan looked at her, his expression unchanged, not defensive, not triumphant, just present. He did not respond right away. He did not need to. The moment did not ask for anything more from him. Mrs. Collins continued, her eyes remaining on him, not looking away. "I did not listen," she added quietly. "And I should have." The classroom absorbed the words in silence, each student processing them in their own way, some looking down, some looking at Jordan, some simply sitting still, aware that something important was happening. Jordan's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the drawing again, his thumb tracing the line where the tear had been. He nodded once, small but clear. "It is okay," he said, his voice calm, without hesitation, without resentment. The simplicity of the response carried more weight than anything else that had been said. Mrs. Collins' expression softened further, the tension that had been held in her posture finally releasing. She gave a small nod in return, not as authority, but as understanding. Around them, the classroom remained quiet, but the quiet had changed once more. It was no longer just reflective. It was warm. The kind of quiet that comes when something has been repaired, not perfectly, but honestly. Outside the door, a faint shadow passed again, a reminder that the man who had entered earlier was still nearby, still present, even without stepping back into the room. Jordan glanced briefly toward the door, then back to his desk, his focus steady, grounded. Mrs. Collins rose slowly to her full height again, but she did not return to the board immediately. She looked around the room once more, meeting the eyes of her students one by one, as if making sure they had all seen what mattered. "We learn from each other," she said finally, her voice calm, carrying a new kind of authority, one that did not come from control, but from understanding. No one spoke. No one needed to. The lesson had already been given, and it was not written anywhere. It existed in the space between them, in the way they now saw each other, in the way they would remember this moment long after the day ended. And at his desk, Jordan sat with the drawing in front of him, the tear still visible, the lines still steady, no longer something broken, but something that had been seen, accepted, and quietly made whole. The classroom did not rush back to routine even as the clock on the wall ticked forward, each second sounding a little clearer in the quiet that remained. Outside, the faint movement of students passing between classes could be heard in the distance, lockers opening and closing, voices rising and falling, but inside this room, everything moved at a different pace. Jordan sat still at his desk, the drawing in front of him no longer something fragile, no longer something to defend. The tear was still there, a thin line running through the image, but it no longer felt like damage. It felt like part of the story. He rested his hand lightly beside it, not covering it, not fixing it, just letting it exist as it was. Mrs. Collins stood near the front, her posture no longer rigid, her presence no longer defined by control. She looked around the room slowly, taking in each student, each quiet expression, each small shift that had taken place without being announced. When her gaze returned to Jordan, it held steady for a moment longer, not as a teacher observing a student, but as a person recognizing another. Then, without saying anything more, she gave a small nod, a gesture so simple it might have been missed if not for the weight it carried. Jordan noticed. He did not react outwardly, but his shoulders eased just slightly, the smallest sign that something had settled. The door remained open just a few inches, the strip of light across the floor now softer as the afternoon sun shifted. A shadow moved once more in the hallway, slower this time, then paused briefly at the edge of the doorway before continuing on. Jordan did not turn to look. He did not need to. He already knew his father was there, not watching to correct, not waiting to intervene, but simply present. The class continued their work quietly, pencils moving, pages turning, but the energy in the room had changed in a way that could not be undone. A student near the back glanced up at Jordan again, then down at their own paper, as if reconsidering something they had written earlier. Another leaned back slightly, their expression thoughtful, carrying the moment with them in a way that would last beyond the day. Mrs. Collins walked slowly back to her desk and picked up the marker, but this time, when she turned to the board, she did not write instructions or corrections. She simply wrote one word in clear, careful letters. Respect. She paused, looking at it for a second, then stepped aside, leaving it there without explanation. No one asked what it meant. No one needed to. The word stood on its own, just like everything else that had happened. Jordan looked up at the board briefly, then back at his drawing. His fingers traced along the line where the tear had been, then rested still. He did not try to change it. He did not try to make it perfect. He simply accepted it, the way he had accepted everything else, quietly and without resistance. The bell rang a few minutes later, sharp and sudden, breaking the stillness but not erasing it. Students began to gather their things, slower than usual, more deliberate, as if they were carrying something invisible with them. Chairs moved, backpacks lifted, but the noise felt softer, more contained. Jordan closed his notebook carefully, placing the drawing inside without folding it, keeping it as it was. He stood, pushing his chair in gently, and turned toward the door. As he stepped into the hallway, the light shifted again, and there, just a few feet away, his father stood waiting. No words were exchanged. No explanation was needed. The man looked at him, his expression calm, steady, and Jordan looked back the same way. Then, without ceremony, they walked side by side down the hallway, their steps even, their presence quiet. Behind them, inside the classroom, the word remained on the board, unchanged. And for everyone who had been there, it would not fade. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. But in the end, He showed them what truth looks like when it stands still.